tied up in a straight line, and everywhere you turn, there's vultures and thieves at your back. The storm keeps on twisting, keep on building the lies that you make up for all that you lack. It don't make no it's easier to believe in this sweet madness, all this glorious sadness that brings me to my knees in the arms of the angel. Fly away from this dark, cold hotel room and the endlessness that you feel. You are pulled from the wreckage of your silent reverie in the arms of the angel. May you find some comfort here. You're in the arms of the angel. May you find some comfort here.
Roger L. Uecker was born on September 11, 1945, and passed from this life on September 23, 2020, at the age of 75 years. Roger grew up in rural Nebraska on a farm with his brother and 3 sisters. There, his work ethic developed that would serve him well throughout his life. He earned a teaching degree in college, where he was also on the basketball and tennis teams. He had 2 children, Robin and Brad, in his first marriage to Pam. As a high school teacher at several small towns in Nebraska, he taught industrial arts, driver's education, and math. He also coached football, basketball, and golf, and he enjoyed golfing himself. He was a social worker for 25 years at the Nebraska Department of Corrections and held several part-time jobs at Radio Shack, a grade school bus driver, and a marshal on a golf course. Roger finished many families' basements. He built decks. He helped friends find used cars. He worked on their cars and gave fix-it advice. He loved motorcycles. Later in life, he had to give up riding after an aortic dissection and stroke. But Roger wouldn't sell his bike to just anyone. He sold it to a dear friend, Ken Schmidt. He loved his family very much. He used his fix-it skills when Robin called with an issue at her house. He always looked forward to Saturdays when Brad would come over and they worked on cars, refurbishing 2 antique cars. Brad religiously took care of blowing out gutters on Roger's and Dee's home, and also helped neighbors, Jerry Gorman's and her sister, Teresa Smith's home. He was always interested in what his grandchildren were doing. Grace and Harrison, Samantha and Hunter, and Hailey and Tyler brought him great joy and a lot of fun. He's preceded in death by his parents, Fred and Evelyn Uecker. Also a daughter, Robin Holloway, a son, Brad Uecker, and is survived by his wife, Dee Uecker, stepdaughters, Sarah and Derek Amos, Jana and Waco Whitmarsh, son-in-law, David Holloway, daughter-in-law, Donna Uecker, grandchildren Grace and Harrison Holloway, Samantha and Hunter Amos, Hailey and Tyler Whitmarsh, plus a brother and sisters. And I know you'll agree with me when I say that he will be greatly missed. But with these things being said, I feel like a life of 75 years spent in so many good ways. It's hard to encapsulate everything in just a few paragraphs and 10 minutes on a Saturday morning. It's like watching a 3-hour baseball game and then trying to tell just what it was like by reading the line scores later. And so instead of just having some words on paper here, I know that Dee has some things that she would like to share that will fill in some gaps and paint the picture just a little bit more fully. So, Dee?
Thank you all for coming to share this day. Hope I can get through this. When Roger first came home from the hospital on September 14th, the first thing he said was, "Where's the remote?" I'm not kidding. I think Robin inherited Roger's fix-it skills and his sense of humor. Robin always said that she was handier than her husband Dave. And she was. I'll miss the times when Brad and Harrison came over and played cards with us. Those were good times. Roger's humor never left him as his health declined. Last night, Grace and Harrison recalled a trip to Jimbo's Diner when the waitress said to him, "Now don't you get into trouble and go to jail." And he says, "I've been in jail for 30 years. He worked for the Department of Corrections. One joke that we remembered last night was, how do you make a tissue dance? Put a little boogie in it. So, just typical of his jokes. He also, in these last days, he joked with the nurses at the hospital and the certified nurses that came to us from Endless Journey. He gave them some trouble, Roger and I met at Flashbacks. It's a bar that's no longer there. We were both at a place in our lives where we needed somebody else. I think we knew there was something to our relationship when on our first date, we found out that my birth date, June 22nd, was his former wedding anniversary. When we met, I was welcomed into a company of his golf friends and their spouses. We had many times traveling to golf courses. Roger prided himself in being a professional driver, and he enjoyed reserving restaurants. He'd get tips. He was a courtesy van driver for Kia, and he'd get tips from people he would transport. So we just had to go out and check out those restaurants to see if they were that good. There was a time when we showed up at a restaurant, only to find that the venue was abuzz with a wedding reception. We couldn't eat there. Some towns were 20 and 30 miles away. One time we were about an hour late, having taken the wrong turn. And at the next restaurant get-together, Carol Logan presented Roger with several mini compasses. They're on the back table. Roger jumped into being a second dad to Sarah and Jana. And both Roger and Sarah were very protective of me. And he taught, being a driver's ed teacher, he taught Jana to drive, he taught my niece Marcy to drive, and Harrison and Grace to drive. And he was always a critique of your driving also. David, Sarah and Jana, Waco and Derek, thank you for being by my side these hard days. Grace and Harrison, Samantha and Hunter, Hailey and Tyler, you were the joy of your Grandpa Roger's life, and you are of mine. Grandchildren are the number one top on my list of greatest things in life. God made our lives, Roger's and everyone's in this room, our families and friends, our lives come together to make the world a better place. Roger has only left his physical presence to be with other family and friends. He will always remain in our hearts. And Roger, we're glad that we got to be with you. I think Dave was going to say a few words. Dave?
Dee, thank you for this opportunity to speak on behalf of Roger. I can't think of any other greater honor to do so. And when I think of Roger, I think most of you would respond, if you were to describe him, as he's a good guy. But what does good guy really mean? And I was trying to figure out how to describe, Roger in a setting like this. And you just start with who he was as a person. Roger was a builder. He could build just about anything. And in fact, I venture to guess at least 70% of us had worked with Roger on a car or a basement or a deck or something that was broken that needed to be fixed. And he was so skilled at that. But what he did with his skill is that he shared it. He didn't just kind of cocoon up and keep to himself. He used it as a tool to engage. And so he would build these beautiful things for people that he knew and in many cases didn't know. And yeah, I can validate what Dee said earlier about his kids, Robin and Brad. He passed that talent down to them. And so the joke was that the toolbox that Roger bought for Robin was hers. And I never was able to touch the toolbox because I didn't know what I was doing. The other thing that Roger and Dee did really well, I'd say masterfully, is build community. And that's an art. That's a skill that I'm jealous of. There wasn't a waiter or an attendant or a coworker where Roger wasn't able to engage or crack a joke. I know if you went to lunch or dinner with him, whoever was serving our table that day, he got to know their name. He got to know where they were from and what they were doing. And oftentimes I would sit there and say, "Oh, Roger, just order." But Roger knew what he was doing because he was connecting with a random person, and in a small way, he made that person's day better. And again, there's no secret to what he did. It was just the discipline to meet people where they were at and communicate with them in a way that made their day feel good. Roger had a lot of talents, and I don't know, years ago I would have said joke telling wasn't one of them. But as a family, we endured a lot of these jokes, and I did. I wrote a few of these down because this was Roger. What did the shark say after eating a clownfish? That tasted funny. Why does a duck have feathers? To cover his butt quack. What do you call cheese that's not yours? Nacho cheese. And I remember Whenever Raj would come over to visit the kids, you'd have to wait about 10 minutes for him to work through these jokes with the kids before you really got to engage with whatever the topic was you needed to talk about. And at the time, as a younger guy, I'm just like, okay, let's get to this. But again, it was part of who Roger was. It was his talent. It was his skill to plug in and engage in love. My kids will always remember Roger for the jokes that he told. And what a pleasant thing to remember. Just as I told you the jokes, everybody chuckled. I didn't see anybody get angry or get mad. And that was his way of pulling everybody in. Roger and Dee were masters at building community. Their lunches and dinners, I know Robin and I occasionally would call them up and say, hey, old couple, we're gonna bless you with our time, and you wanna get together Friday night? No, we're busy. We've got a friend group we've gotta go to. Okay, how about Saturday? We got a breakfast group that we gotta go to. How about Saturday afternoon? We're on a golf league. And so they didn't have time for people that didn't want to engage and have fun. But boy, if you wanted to join their crowd, they would suck you in and you were a part of their lives. Again, that's a skill and a talent that we could only long to hope for, Dee. Roger loved well. He loved his family well. There wasn't a thing that he wouldn't have done for any one of us, for his grandchildren, his children, and his friends and his coworkers. He lived a life outwardly. And again, that's a life well lived because he loved so well. And again, that's something as a young person that I'm trying to tell the kids today and my kids, there's a formula to this. It's not a secret. There's a formula to this life, and it's loving outwardly. And that's what Raj is. When you try and describe him as a good guy and define it, it's all these tiny little things that he had the discipline to do on a daily basis. Dee, you, throughout this process, and if anybody has ever taken care of somebody with a chronic illness, it's a heavy burden. And Dee, you loved Roger so well through this process. And his two kids weren't here to carry that load with you. But I've told you time and time again from afar, you did the heavy lifting so well. But he had two other daughters that filled that void for his two kids, and Jana and Sarah and the family, Waco. I can't thank you enough. The words escape me because you loved him when he needed it the most. When others couldn't, you bore that burden. But I will say, he made it easy on you. He was gracious. I kept on telling extended family how at peace Roger was through this process. And it's not a fun process to go through, but he carried that burden as well. I know I was over at Dee's and she was trying to, and thankfully he was home where he wanted to be. She was trying to help him go to the bathroom, and she was explaining to me the story of carrying him over and getting him to the restroom. And Dee said to Roger, I bet you didn't think you could do this. And Roger was a fairly big guy, and that's not an easy load for one person to do. And Roger turned to Dee and said, I bet you didn't think that you could do this. And so Roger loved you so much, Dee, and he appreciated all that you did for he and his family. That's what love is outwardly. It's caring for somebody when nobody else knows that you're doing it in their greatest time of need. So I recently have been going through a Bible study, and bear with me through this. It's Galatians 5 and 6, and Paul was basically talking to us, and he was basically saying there's a way to live a good life, and it's through the fruits of the Spirit. And in Galatians 5, he describes what those fruits are. By the Holy Spirit, you produce this kind of fruit in your life: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There's no law against these. Who could be against these? That's Roger. That's a good guy. That's a life well lived. And I tell you all of this because it matters. In this study that we're doing, Paul talks about the harvest, and you reap what you sow on a daily basis. So if you go back to the few stories, the tiny stories that I was able to share with you today, engaging with somebody at a restaurant that's serving your table and is probably busy and stressed out, cracking a joke with them and getting to know them by their first name matters. Engaging with your kids on a daily basis to find out what their needs are, doing odd projects for friends, or building a car together with your grandkids matters. What you sow every single day is what you reap. And one thing that I know for certain about Roger is that he didn't leave anything on the table. He lived a really good life with his partner Dee and his grandkids and his kids. I'm jealous for that. But again, there's no secret to how to do this. God tells us that a life well lived is living outwardly by love, joy, peace, kindness, and corny jokes. Nobody got mad at Roger when he told a corny joke. They smiled. And that's what Roger's life was all about. And I think we all can say that, yes, he's a good person, but he's more than that. He's a teacher. He's a mentor to how we all can change each and every day of our lives to live outwardly. So, Dee, thank you so much for giving me this honor to speak on his behalf. I don't do it justice, but I will leave everyone with this. After Robin died, bear with me, my daughter Grace asked me, "Do you think Mom misses us?" And at that moment, I said, "Grace, if Robin could have 30 seconds with us, just 30 seconds, she would say, live a good life, love others, and love God so that you can be with me in heaven." So Robin's not longing to be back here. She's longing for us to be there. And the same goes for Roger. Roger and Robin and Brad are together now, and they all long for us to be there. Let's use their lives as a roadmap to live a better life, a life well lived and a life well loved. Thanks. Thanks, Jim.
So we don't want to cut this time short. Are there other family members that might like to say something on Roger's behalf? Yes.
Roger's my uncle. Dee's my aunt. I'm from Des Moines, and growing up, I've always come to Omaha, especially for Thanksgiving, and I'd always stay with Dee and Roger when I was younger, and I would always look forward to going on motorcycle rides with Roger. Dee wasn't big on going on them, but I was, so we always got to go on rides, and there's a picture in the slideshow of us, and that day we went on a 3-hour motorcycle ride, and that was so fun, and then we stopped at Renza, because he likes Renza. So many fun memories with Roger. I'm not big on golf. It's not my thing. Roger loved golf, and Saturday mornings, I'd sit in the living room with Roger and we watch golf, except it was different with Roger because he would explain golf to me. He would explain everything down to the clubs and the clubs that they were using, and tell me about each player and stories, and then tell me about his time with golfing. And so it was just different watching golf with Roger than just watching golf. It made it a little more interesting. And, you know, we'd watch his Western movies. Again, not something that I enjoy, but somehow with Roger, it was enjoyable. He always made things fun. Lots of jokes, lots of good memories. Best uncle you could ever have. Taught me how to drive. Let me tell you. My mom tried to teach me, put the car in the ditch, worst thing ever, never again. She said, me and you are never gonna be in the car together again. And I said, I know. So then we tried to do the whole street smarts in Des Moines, and that's a place you pay and they teach you to drive. I went on 2 trips with the driver, And I said, I'm never getting back in the car with him again. He's scary. He yelled at me. I can't do this. So I was scared I would never drive again. And my mom called my aunt, and she goes, oh, Roger will teach her how to drive. That's no problem. So we got a car, and we came up to Omaha, and I stayed for 2 weeks, and I was terrified to even get behind the wheel at that point. And somehow with Roger, I was not afraid at all. He made everything easy. And I mean, I was terrified. I literally didn't think I would ever be able to drive a car. But with Roger, he was so calm and patient with me. And I got back and I aced my driving test, and I'm the best parallel parker, I'm just letting you know. And I was terrified to do that, and Roger taught me. And every time I get in the car, I always remember Roger, do not pass somebody until they're behind you in your mirror. I just hear him when I drive all the time, just the little things he taught me through driving. And I will always hear his voice while I drive, just the little things, minus not listening to loud music, because I can't really help that part. But Roger was just the best, and he had such a good nature about him, just the kindest person, which is why I think him and my aunt went so well together. Roger loved his grandkids. Just when he would talk about them, he'd light up. That was the joy in his life. And Dee was so awesome about doing everything with the grandkids together too. I would come up over Thanksgiving usually every year for a really long time. And I remember all of us going with Hunter and Grace and the other grandkids. We'd go see Christmas lights. We'd drive around and see the lights, and we'd go go to the gingerbread houses, and sometimes we'd do like a Christmas craft, or we'd go to the craft shows. Just always so much fun, and they just loved doing stuff with the kids. That was their favorite thing to do. And anybody that knows Roger just knows how much he cared about his grandkids and his family. I had surgery in June, and Dee called me, and I was in the hospital, and I couldn't eat anything at that time, and I was starving. And Dee and Roger were just getting ready to go out to eat for breakfast, and I was like, oh, I'm so jealous. Tell Roger to eat a bunch of bacon for me too. And so they went to breakfast, and Roger had Dee take a picture of him eating bacon and send it to me in the hospital on my phone, and I was cracking up because I was like, that's Roger, smiling, eating some bacon for me. So Roger made a big impact on my life and everyone else's, and I just feel very blessed to have him in our lives. So just wanted to say a couple things.
Thank you. David, is there anybody else? Yes.
I'm kind of an emotional person, so I hope I can get through this. Roger, Dee already mentioned this, but Roger was the official organizer of our Dining Out Adventure Group. And he'd call us about this new place that he'd heard about, and he'd make the reservation and get the word out to the group. And it was usually that new place somewhere out in Nebraska or over in Iowa. And so we'd have to load up a caravan of cars, and away we'd go. And Dee already mentioned the one time that we'll never forget when we went to outside of Fremont. And everybody was hungry. We were ready for a steak dinner. And we get there, and it's closed for a private wedding. And they said, oh, I'm sorry, your reservation is for next Friday night. So we missed out on that one. But he picked some good places, and we always got to have a new experience. And we even got a few places that we would go back to because they were so good. Roger had this uncanny way of calling Gary and me, and when we'd be out of town on a vacation or on a golf trip somewhere, and we might be driving down the road in Vermont or out on the golf course or going to the golf course in Kansas, and the phone in the car would ring, and we'd turn to each other and kind of laugh and said, I'll bet that's Roger. And by gosh, it was Roger. And so he just always had this uncanny way of calling us. Well, we missed that call this past week when we were out of town driving through Minnesota. And I'll also miss answering the phone or overhearing a conversation when he would be talking to Gary because he'd call, or Gary would call and say, "This is the president, Nancy Pelosi, Pete Ricketts, Bill Moose, Scott Frost, or Fred Hoiberg, or some other prominent political or Nebraska sports figure." And they would just carry on the conversation as they discussed all the political news and the games. Well, we'll miss those adventures and those calls and the Saturday morning breakfasts at Jimbo's Diner. Just won't be the same without Roger. And his corny jokes, which you've already heard. And I was able to save some of those and pass them on to my grandkids, who laughed too. But the one thing I'll always remember, when everybody was ready to leave, Roger would always say, "Well, I'm glad you got to see me." And I am glad that I did get to see him and share his friendship. We'll miss him dearly.
Those are such great memories. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else who would like to speak? I had a friend of mine not long ago. He said, when it comes my time to be up front here, he says, "I don't think all my stories can be told in church." Now, I don't know if that's true of Roger or not, but I'm guessing as the day goes on, as the weeks go on, there's going to be more and more stories remembered, more things told about Roger. It sounds like he gave you a lot to talk about. But for now, I'd just like us to just think for a minute while we listen to this next song that the family has selected. So the Bible is made up of, it's a collection of 66 different books that are put together. One book that gets read a lot in times like this is the book of Psalms. And inside the Psalms, there are 150 different psalms in there. And these psalms were written not just as poetry. We typically read them as if they're poetry. Most of these were written to be song lyrics. They would add music to these, and they would sing these lyrics as they went to worship. And probably the favorite and most read of the 150 psalms in here is Psalm 23. The 23rd Psalm. We typically call it the Shepherd's Psalm. But I'd like to read that today, and I'm not going to take a long time, but as I read this, I hope you'll see it in a little different light than maybe you've seen it before. I read a good book recently by a man named Philip Keller, who, as a child, he and his family were in the deserts of the Holy Land, and they actually raised sheep over there. They knew a lot about shepherding, and he reflects on what King David is writing about in Psalm 23. Now, as we read the Psalm 23, there's three different movements here. The very first one, you've got the shepherd and the sheep down on the farm where everything's predictable, everything is good. And you've got this psalm told from the perspective of a talking sheep. Now, if you're old enough to remember Mr. Ed the Talking Horse, anybody old enough for that? Ladies, you don't have to admit it. But if you can put that kind of a voice with Psalm 23, I think you get a little more of the idea of what David was going for. He talks about deep things, but he puts it in the perspective of a talking sheep. So imagine a sheep, he's got his head poked through the fence, he's talking to the neighbor's sheep, and he's going to brag about how great a shepherd he has. And he uses the word he. He uses second person here. If you've studied English, second person means you're talking about somebody. You use words like he or she. And so notice this talking sheep, talking to the neighbor's sheep. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And down on the farm where everything's predictable, everything's good, you've got green grass to eat, you've got fresh water to drink, you've got straight paths to walk. Life is so good for this sheep, and it's real easy to follow the shepherd when life is good. And maybe you have times like that in your life where everything is just good, maybe for a few days, maybe for a couple of weeks. I mean, things like you drive across town and you're hitting all green lights. You pull into McDonald's and they get your order right. I hope nobody here works at McDonald's, okay? But there's just things that happen and you think, man, life is so good. Yeah, everything just seems so good. And that's how that sheep is feeling. And he says, oh, the Lord is my shepherd, and I couldn't imagine any other shepherd. But if you've lived any amount of time at all, you know that life isn't always down on the farm. Life isn't always a straight line. It's not always good. And so as we get to the next part of the psalm, you see that the shepherd has had to move the sheep off the farm during the hot summer months when the grass dries up, the water disappears. He's got to move the sheep from the safety of the farm to the foothills or the high country, where there might be some little pools of water, there might be shade where grass would grow. And in the trip, and in the time in the mountains, there's dangers. There could be rock slides. There could be wild animals waiting to attack. There could be all kinds of things when you're off the farm. And notice how the sheep continues to talk. And now he's not talking about the shepherd. He doesn't use the word he. He uses first person. Now it's you, because they're eyeball to eyeball. When times get hard, when times get tough, notice how the sheep says this, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. And this sheep understands that if you can follow this shepherd when times are good, he needs to be the kind of shepherd you can also follow when times are bad. And like I say, if you've lived any amount of time at all in this world, you've had bad times. And they look different for different people. You know, the bad time might be a phone call from the doctor's office where he says, "We got the test results back, and I need to see you in my office tomorrow." It might be a phone call in the middle of the night and says, "This is the emergency room, there's been an accident, you need to come right away." It could be a knock on the door and somebody's serving a divorce paper. It could be a pink slip in your last paycheck and they say thank you, but there won't even be a gold watch. Yet there could be all kinds of bad things happen in this life, and you've probably been through some. And this little sheep here says, even though, meaning regardless what comes, regardless how life is, whether it's down on the farm, whether it's here in the mountains, I'm sticking with you. The Lord is my shepherd, and I'll stick with you in good times and in bad. And the last part of the psalm, you'll notice that the sheep is still talking, but he's not talking to anybody. He's more thinking inside his own head. They're headed from the mountains back to the farm again at the end of the season. And he says this, inside his own head, "Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever, because the Lord is my shepherd." And you could start that whole song over again. He sounds like a pretty confident sheep, doesn't he? I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. He doesn't use the word maybe. He doesn't use the phrase, if I get lucky, or if all the stars align, or no asterisk there. He just says, I will. And he's not confident in his own goodness. He's not confident that he's such a perfect sheep, but he's confident that if he follows the right shepherd, he sticks with him in good times and in bad, the shepherd's going to lead him home in the end. And he puts his confidence in the shepherd. I love how David simplifies life and death and eternity in the story of a talking sheep. I'm from Missouri, and I can understand it. But as I come to the end of it, I can't help but think of what Jesus told his disciples before he left this earth. He said, I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I'll come back and take you to be with me. So where I am, there you may be also. That's what the shepherd wants. There's a story I read, and I hope it's okay to throw in a corny joke. I read this story, and it's just a short one, but it's about a guy that moves into town, and it's a small town, but he wants to open his own business, so he opens a florist shop. And a few months in, somebody relocates next door to him in an empty office building, and business is going well. There's a funeral home right down the street, and this guy's just doing real well in his new florist business. But a guy came in one week, and he said, hey, I need to see the manager. And he says, well, I'm the only one here. That's me. And he said, well, I got a bone to pick with you. I was in here last week, and I ordered flowers from my friend that relocated next door to you. Well, you sent him flowers all right, but you put a ribbon on there that said, rest in peace. And the guy just slaps his forehead, and he says, I am so sorry. He says, I don't know how that happened. All I know how to do right now is apologize, and I'll refund your money. But about that time, he smiled a little bit, and he said, but you know, if those flowers went over there, I think the ones that went to the funeral home had the ribbon that said, good luck in your new location. And isn't that kind of what we're saying to Roger today? I mean, I am not a judge. I don't determine who goes where, who doesn't go where, and neither do you. We're fellow travelers in this life, and we're trying to figure things out. David wrote a great psalm here about choosing wisely who we follow. Follow in good times, follow in bad times, and we follow him home in the end. I hope you'll think about this little passage as we just listen to the next song that the families picked out. I think you'll see some correlation.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, we have already come. 'Twas grace that brought us safe thus far, and grace will lead us home. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've known less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
Immediately following this service, the family would very much like, for everybody who can to join them, back at the house. And the address is in the program, but it's 501 South 83rd Street, just 1 block south and 1 block east of 84th and L. If you need any directions, I'm sure Dee or some of the family can direct you on how to get there. But they would very much like to have you join them for some food and just to continue to talk about Roger and his life. As we dismiss our service today, I'd just like to close us in prayer And following the prayer, we will be dismissed, and it'll be an informal dismissal. If you'd like to stay here and visit for a while, you can sure do that. But we'll just take some time and then make our way back to the house, for the luncheon. Father, we're so grateful to you for granting us life here on this earth, time to love other people and to receive love from people, to invest in others. Well, we've heard so many good things today about how Roger was all about others. And that's something that, boy, for some people, you have to tell them that over and over again to get us to change our ways and be like that. But for some people, it's just a natural thing for them. And it sounds like that was just part of Roger. He took care of so many people in this life. And so, Father, we just ask you to take good care of him now. Thank you for the love that you show us. Thank you for your grace, for your mercy. Thank you for tapping people on the shoulder through the years and have them write down things in your word that we can understand you and understand your ways a little more fully. And I thank you for life here on this earth. I thank you for passing from life here to life eternal, as scary as it seems, because we haven't traveled that way before. But we put our hope and trust in you and ask you to take good care of us. Thank you for the good that you allowed Roger to bring into this world. And I pray for his good family, that you'll help them as they transition into a different reality now. Please provide them with comfort, with peace, and with strength. And I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.